And now being myself at a university where I've taken in my past, say, 3 jobs now, always the opportunity and also really focused on trying to study what I'm doing. So I wrote a book about being a minister. That's in Dutch. It doesn't translate easily. I wrote a book about the World Bank. I'm writing now a book about universities. And that's what I want to share with you in some, say, short elements, in the sense that, first of all, I think it's really important that universities start to think about themselves. Because my first conclusion in the book will be that up to now, in Europe, but I think it's presumably much more worldwide, universities are determined by a context which is set by people who don't know universities. It's by politicians, by outsiders, sometimes also by industrialists, which stand quite far away, and seldom universities are heard in that process. So my first point is, universities start to look at yourself, ask yourself the questions of why you are there and what you want to achieve, and then secondly, of course, make that point felt. This is also my answer to what the chair just asked a second ago. You seem to be talking a lot about innovation in universities and not so much about finance. And I said to him, yes, because I feel that if you want to have a good pledge for finance, you have to know what you sell. You have to know what you do. And so that's the way in which I came to the combination of, say, substance and finance. So finance from the position of what is it a university reasonably can ask to be financed by society, by individuals, private parties, by society, public finance, by other means. So my setup then is, my outline is very much looking at the globalized labor market as a driving force, as it should be, for university training. And I all the time talk about university as learning institutions. The R word will hardly be used by me, R for research. At the moment when you watch university websites of top universities, and I did so also for some of the Korean universities, by the way, then in a way I feel we are not doing the right thing, because they talk all the time about research. Universities are first and foremost about learning, about teaching, about education. And of course the research which is done there to support that learning and education should be just of excellent quality. But that's an of course and a second thought in this respect. So you might actually want to question that. So I start with the globalized labor market. The globalized labor market translates in demands for universities, but in particular, in my view, in demands for world building rather than nation building, with the history that nation building always used to be extremely important for universities. The question for me was always whether the emerging migration patterns are doing justice to these questions from the globalized labor market and the nation building. And my answer is no, not exactly. I mean, they do contribute to the demands, say, put on universities. So in this respect, that migration pattern, I think, is helpful. Then I very much look at the university innovation agenda, with then the necessary conditions for finance. And ladies and gentlemen, there's lots and lots to be changed. There's lots to be changed in the conditions for finance, but that also has very much some implications for governance. I look very much also then, of course, at the relationship between public and private contributions, and then come with some conclusions. And I start again with that globalized labor market, where I mentioned yesterday that 80% of the European Union graduates, 80% says in surveys time and again, it was in the Cheers survey for the first time in 1996, was in the Cheers survey of 1998, 2000, 2002, we work on the globalized labor market. 80% of the graduates say that they are daily in contact, it doesn't say how often, but with someone who speaks another language, has another culture. Globalization for you. globalization in a way in which, in fact, it has made the nationalness of universities obsolete. And then you have a problem if you say that, because what do we have beyond nationalness? Of course, we have, in some countries, we have, say, the nationalness of the region, which translates in the federation. We have in the European Union the chance to bring something to the European Union level, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm really looking at something which does more to universities than just bring it to another level of, say, new nationality. But my main point is that when I look again at websites of universities, I've not a single one, and I've not done the whole job of going through the 40,000, but I've taken many of the US universities, top universities, many of the European top universities, and then no one talks about the fact that their students are made ready for a globalized labor market. It's nowhere in the vision of universities. How come? And I think it has a lot to do with the way in which universities are built, in the sense that they very much are concentrating on the going concern. Now, taking you one step back, what a globalized labor market means and how that was put in the context of the big thinkers, I would say, and the tradition of universities. I go back to Comparé, a book which was published in 1898, which talks about the European universities in the 11th century and 12th century, early universities. They were set up by kings or by bishops or by actually cardinals or by the Pope in order to create, indeed, leadership. This was always an uneasy relationship because they knew the universities would have to have some independence, and at the same time independence was not that much rewarded. But they did this with the notion of, say, nation building. Traditionally, that role has been very much firm in European universities, also firm in American universities. Read about the book of Slauson, 1910, about the emergence of the American universities, the land-grant universities, the endowed universities, and you'll be convinced of the notion that they started all with that background. Then in Europe you had big thinkers, Newman, Cardinal Newman, you had von Humboldt, all about nation building. But then after the Second World War you see this tremendous growth, differentiated. First the US, gradual actually, and then Europe with an explosion. And now also Asia with an explosion. Europe with a 20-fold number of students within 20 years. So a great expansion. And you notice at the same time that the notion of leadership gets lost. The notion of leadership is no longer there in the writings about universities. Universities are there to supply well-trained manpower, which industry needs, which society needs. And it's a lost claim to civic leadership. And I think at present the challenge is really for universities to, and maybe not for all in the same way, but to provide for that globalized labor market and to provide for globalized world leadership. Now, is, say, migration going to do the job? Is it so that when more students migrate, they will, say, by nature, pick up cultural differences and are able to work with them? And just to give you some background on migration and the very fast development in migration, estimations are that the number of migrating students will double in the next 5 years, from 2.5 million to 5 million, where originally this was very much a migration towards the Anglo-Saxon countries. Where Australia very much joined in the process. Australia had 0% foreign students in 1990, or pretty close to zero, and has now 70% of its students, 17, is foreign student. By policy, also bringing about, I do think, some of that global leadership. But from 2000 onwards then, you see that regional migration is increasing. Most interesting, I think, is the role of China in this respect, which is very much a component of regional migration, but also Japan has taken it on. I see also signs here in this country, in Korea, that you are more interested now in regional migration. we notice in the few econometric studies which I could find that the main reason for students to migrate is still human capital, is still the notion that they qualify better for a labor market in all respects. I would say human capital in the sense of it's really a good investment in yourself, not maybe just from the monetary point of view, but also from the point of view of increased potential to benefit psychologically from your work. So quality does play a substantial role. A fast increase is expected in the next decades. The flow will definitely be more geographically diverse, where I found it also interesting 2 days ago when I was at the National University in Seoul, where still the notion was very much that students from Korea migrate to other countries. Not really very much in mind that maybe students from other countries might migrate to Korea. That is, in my view, definitely the future. But this does not satisfy sufficiently the university innovation agenda, where I talk about the university innovation agenda in the sense in which also Derek Bock, in his, I would say, landmark book, The Underachieving Colleges, and then he talks about the US, speaks. Derek Bock is actually pretty low on US universities, contrary to what I think many of us might think, in the colleges, in the sense that he says they are not innovating fast enough. They should do far more in innovation, which is logical that they innovate not as much, because I would say the transition costs or transaction costs are simply far too high. How come that there's only one university in the world, which I believe is Maastricht at the moment, which uses problem-based learning, which is time and again shown to be superior in learning efficiency, you might say, compared to other forms of teaching? Well, you can see what it means to university to go from one system, which is lecture-based teaching, to another system. And you notice that the transaction costs are too high. And by the way, there is this focus on the going concern, and also a concern about market share. You don't have the time to innovate because simply you would lose market share. And so too few innovations for, let me just mention a couple of things. For e-learning, great promise of the 90s and hardly anything realized. Second, dual or concurrency learning, work combined with institutionalized learning. Superior in terms of efficiency of learning, hardly applied. Joint or dual degrees, now coming about, fortunately I hope, but still on too low a level. Curriculum updates, how often do they occur in this globalized labor market? Once again, look at the websites. And I think universities should be ashamed of not thinking constantly about where they are involved with and update their curriculum in order to do the right thing for their graduates. And then, in my case, I would very much also like to press for the issue of cross-cultural learning, because the globalized labor market needs people who respect and understand the culture of others. And then finance. Then finance comes at the end. Finance comes at the end where universities are willing to undergo, say, the transformations needed from the globalized labor market and from the globalized need for leadership. Necessary conditions for finance in a very different way, I think, than at the moment financial conditions are arranged. Europe, I think, is not the only one which has suffered tremendous cuts in public finance in per student terms, a decrease by almost 50%, and that's Europe-wide in per student expenditures in the past 20 years, without the ability to increase tuition fees in public education systems. And then I just wanted to make a quick...
2 minutes.
2 minutes, yes. I'm just trying to make my main point. When you look at public to private contributions, then you notice, can you see this? Korea is at your right-hand side. You might say you're doing the best. No, not really, because that is still something to be evaluated. But you see a tremendous difference. It would be very important to increase private contributions in order to have sustainable developments in also public universities. Performance-based funding, but with maintenance of, with maintaining equality of opportunity. And by the way, look at the OECD study which recently came out, which shows that equality of opportunity has been declining if you look at the correlation between father's income and the son's income. And particularly equality of opportunity is not present in the country of the great opportunities. It's not in the US. It's also not as much in Britain as it is in many of the other countries. And then, so I come to these conclusions with the notion that the labor market for graduates is international. They should shift universities from nation building to world building, with the possibility of really also adapting in this respect to the international student numbers increase, and with government policies which should be more facilitating in the sense of promoting innovation and also giving the required financing in this respect through the means for private contributions, and of course making then the national organization of universities outmoded. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your patience.
Thanks a lot, Joseph Fritzen, for this program for the future of universities, very courageous. We have now the paper of Marshall Schmidt, who is a very good specialist of problems of education, who taught in Wisconsin, Madison, and Stanford University, and he was Dean of School of Education in Stanford. He has been also politics, as Deputy Secretary and Undersecretary for Education in the Clinton administration, and Chief of Staff of the Secretary for Education. Then now you have 15 minutes, Marshall.
Yes, let me just... Well, thank you very much, and a very good morning to you all. I must apologize a little in advance. At times during this discussion, I may inadvertently smile because my heart is full and my pride is great in what my country did during this last election. I want you all to know that I think the world will be a better place because of it. So my discussion will follow very closely upon what President Fritzen was saying. He was focusing on teaching and learning, and I'm going to focus on teaching and learning also. But I will come at it in a slightly different way. I will first describe the general framework, the context. I think that's been done very nicely, actually, by President Fritzen. So we'll move through that quickly, and then I will move to three interventions or innovations or ideas that might be used in the future to improve the quality of teaching and learning. And when I think about the quality of teaching and learning, I too am thinking about a worldwide economy, about the kinds of challenges that our young people will face in the future, and about the need to prepare them in the most effective and efficient ways. Because a big part of what we're all dealing with and what we will continue to deal with certainly in the near future and even further down is a tremendous economic downturn. We will have to struggle out of that, and it's not at all clear that path will be easy or quick. And so during that time, there'll be great push, substantial push for accountability and for making sure that money is spent well, efficiently, economically, and so on. So the argument is very simple. The world economy is changing. Tertiary education is critical to the economic and social capital of any nation or of the world itself. The demand is growing. We all know that. The changing economy and the technologies interact with each other to make the demands greater for what is taught in colleges and universities, and greater and different from what is taught. The kinds of things that we need to begin to teach are not the typical things that universities teach. It's not facts and straightforward problem solving. It is dealing with ambiguity. It is dealing with uncertainty. It is learning to cope with failure and to learn from failure. And it's learning to work together, collaboratively. Things that wonderfully are happening naturally with our young people as they work together on the web. But the university must pick up and begin to build on that kind of learning that they've already come to. President Ritson talked a little bit about problem-based learning. Much of problem-based learning is collaborative learning. It's people sitting down together and working through problems and figuring out new things and being creative. But the economic stress is on top of us, and the economic stress will lead to accountability. When we think about accountability of universities, typically we think of a lot of inputs and a few outputs. Our inputs are our books, the class size, the buildings themselves, how nice they are, and so on. The outputs at the research universities are research, of course. At research universities, they are also other kinds of things, some associated with learning, but most not. I have had the honor to teach at Harvard and University of Wisconsin and at Stanford, and each of them have had different kinds of measures of their competence. At Harvard, the measure was putting out people to go into life across the world and be leaders of it. At Wisconsin, it was a combination of research and service. At Stanford, it's a combination of a variety of things, but including innovation. And these institutions are all different on these levels. But none of them carefully measure the teaching and learning. There is work at it, but it's not careful and not continuous. And so in the future, our investors, particularly for public institutions, the governments and the private sector, will need to know that the content and the pedagogy are of high quality. They'll need to know that there are effective and efficient methods of teaching. And they'll need to know that tertiary institutions actually add value. They add value to student learning. So the question is, how do we meet these problems? And what I propose are three innovative, possibly disruptive approaches to this. These approaches are things that could be done by a university to give a signal that, in fact, they are interested in improving the quality of their teaching and learning. The first of these is Opencourseware. How many of you are familiar with MIT Opencourseware? How many of you understood what I said when I asked? How many of you are familiar with MIT Opencourseware? I'm really quite amazed at the lack of knowledge of this. Let me just tell you a little bit about what Opencourseware is. About 7 years ago or 8 years ago, in 2001, MIT decided to put all of the materials for all of their courses on the web in a common format for free, for anybody to look at 24/7, anywhere in the world. They said that they wanted to take the knowledge that they had and they wanted to share it with everybody in the world. Everybody in every course. The top physics courses, the top mathematics courses, the top courses in psychology and in engineering and in management, all up on the web for free. They are all there now. All those courses are there now. These are not teaching courses. You can't sit down and take the courses themselves and get credit for them. They describe the materials that go into the courses. They describe the recent thinking of the MIT professors. They describe the edge of what's going on in fields, in all of the fields of science and engineering and lots of other areas. So imagine that. Imagine that a student in the smallest village in Kenya can get access to the kinds of information, the quality of information, the specific information that are used in MIT courses. It's really quite amazing. Since MIT started this, there's also been developed a consortium. There are now 200 members of that consortium for Opencourseware, 75 live sites across the world, 6,000 total courses in at least 10 languages. There are translations. There are lots of courses in more than 10 languages, but there are translations into 10 languages. Here's a course, an honors course in differential equations. It's fairly esoteric for many of you. Running down the side, on the left-hand side over here, you see what is in this on the website about the course. Includes the syllabus, the calendar, the readings, the lecture notes, the assignments, the exams, the projects, related resources, and allows you to download all of the course materials. There are, as I said, 75 live OCDW sites across the world. There'll be some in Africa soon, and there'll be more in South America soon. OCW gets around 2 million, 2.5 million, or did in April 2007, probably gets closer to 4 or 5 million now, visits. This is visits over a substantial amount of time on the site. It's not hits. So they're getting quite a lot of traffic. So what does Opencourseware do for a university? Opencourseware it's open. It gives transparent to the whole world what the content is in the courses. So imagine that you're doing your course and you're putting it up here on the web for free. You're going to take, as a faculty member, you're going to take a little bit of time thinking about that course and making sure that you have the latest up-to-date material, making sure that the logic of your argument in the course is complete, making sure that it's understandable. In other words, it is pushing you to be a better professor, to be a better teacher. Motivates you. If you miss on this course, if you put up something that's sloppy, something that's not new, it's going out to the world, and your peers in some other university will see it. Most professors don't want that to happen. They don't want to get an email right after they put up the course that says they really flubbed that equation. They got the wrong equation. They should be using something different, or their facts are wrong, or whatever. And when you talk to administrators, and this, the president of MIT, I've talked to the president of University of Tokyo about this, and they all say that they see a change in the teaching and learning due to Opencourseware. So Opencourseware is one. Second is web-based courses. These are now teaching courses, right? These are courses that are being taught, and they're using modern technology now to use them. Web 2.0 level technology, high quality stuff. Carnegie Mellon University, they're called cognitive tutors, very high quality content, feedback loops that personalize instruction, so that if you aren't learning something, you get a little assessment, you don't do well on that assessment, and it feeds back and gives you another chance to learn it. So it personalizes courses in ways that no professor sitting in front of a class this size, for example, or in front of huge lectures could possibly personalize their material. The computer program does it for you. And the courses are under student control and motivation. Students can tap into those courses anytime, day or night, when they're feeling fresh. They can go fast at it or slow at it as long as they get it done within a certain amount of time. Now, they've done experiments. Carnegie Mellon's done experiments on these courses, and what they find is that the courses are just as effective as the lectures, by and large. But when they attempted to actually change the ground rules and say that students should learn in half the time from the software courses, from the web-based courses, that they learn from the regular lecture courses, it turns out that students learn more in half the time. And that particular, if you look right here, it's hard to see. Over here, there's a little description of the experiment that was carried out by Carnegie Mellon on this. It's well worth looking into. This is a web page that describes the online learning initiative. Here's the statistics course that was used in the experiment. So imagine now a library of 50 of these courses, self-contained courses, very powerful, created by the best professors in the world around the content, but also created with cognitive scientists who understand notion of learning and feedback and so on. They would support learners. They could be in regular or in supplemental fashion. They could replace lecturers, or they could just be used by lecturers as helping them to move along. This kind of approach is challenging. It challenges the role of professors, but it also challenges the amount that students can learn in a semester. They may be able to learn more in a semester. You may be able to make the whole process of learning much of this content much more efficient. And my guess is that they would be far more effective than many professors, at least in the United States. Because there are many professors in the United States in the second level institutions and some even in the first level institutions that don't take their teaching very seriously. They slack. And as a consequence, these courses would be much more powerful, much more effective at teaching. Powerful implications for efficiency. So that's two. Imagine now a third one, and we'll call it the OECD Learning Assessment. In 2007, the OECD Ministers of Education got together, and the top of their list of things that they wanted to have done was figure out some way of assessing the impact of universities and colleges on learning. They wanted an outcome measure. They wanted sort of an accountability, a soft accountability measure. They wanted to know whether or not institutions were really giving them the added value that they said that they were. This would be an end of the fourth year or at the end of the last year of your college assessment. It would assess 21st century skills, those skills that President Ritson and I both talked about, skills that go beyond the facts and simple problem solving and so on to much more, to complex materials, to creativity, to working together, and so on. And in the future, it may have a baseline.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. This kind of assessment could have potentially very powerful policy implications. The use of this assessment is to improve the institution itself. Now, unfortunately, when you get into something like this, it wouldn't just be used for improving institutions. There would be some sort of rating that would go on, probably. That would have to be worked out inside a country. And since it probably wouldn't be to all the institutions in the country, to a subsample, I don't think the ratings would be taken quite as seriously as ratings are taken in other cases. In any case, the ministers approved a trial assessment. 3 to 4 countries, 3 to 4 institutions per country. Data on results by institution now, not by individuals. And 2 possible kinds of assessment. One for all students, we'll call them 21st century skills, general problem solving, creative writing skills, and so on. And a second one in a particular area, let's say economics or English or whatever, which would be just for the people that actually took those courses of study. So you'd be able to look across the institution at the kinds of learning of these 21st century skills, but you'd also be able to dig into 1 or 2 other areas where there was actual discipline knowledge that needed to be done. So if the trial is successful, OECD thinks that by 2013 it can be available to other countries. This is a special kind of effort, an assessment at the top of it. It really focuses on the effectiveness of the institutions and on the productivity of the institutions. So, quick observations. Each of these approaches, each of these 3 approaches, Opencourseware, open courses, institutional effectiveness, affects or could change an institution's quality, efficiency, and effectiveness. Each of these is possible right now, or at least within the next few years. But each of them challenges conventional practice. And as President Ritson said, it's hard sometimes to change institutions. They have long traditions, powerful ways of maintaining their stability, powerful ways of maintaining the regular course of their work. So the challenge would be to have the expertise and organizational skills to change the culture of the institution, which would require great political will. So what I've set out are 3 provocative and potentially disruptive approaches to thinking about teaching and learning in institutions. I think the payoff is potentially quite substantial. If the traditional institutions themselves do not respond, it's quite possible that for-profit institutions would respond. It is also quite probable that the global economy of universities would also respond and would begin to move students away from your university, which didn't carry out the kinds of improvements that I'm suggesting here. So I'd be very interested in your comments and your thoughts, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I forgot to tell you that Marshall is the Director of Education of Hewlett Foundation. Most important because it's the actual position. Now we have the paper of Harry Anthony Patrinos, who is working for the World Bank as the lead education economist in the Human Development Network. He is a specialist of Latin America and also other countries. Has been traveling very much in Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East, and North America. And he was also formerly as an economist in the Economic Council of Canada. Harry?
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel. It's an honor to come back to the Global HR Forum. I'll be presenting on a very narrow topic, specifically what do we know about financing students to pursue their studies in higher education. Several years ago, the World Bank published a report on lifelong learning where we looked at the different implications of the knowledge economy on learning, on the education systems, and put forward a few suggestions on financing. At that time, based very much on ideas, few of these programs had been implemented, if they had been implemented, not for very long, and we had very little information about the impact of these programs. So we started with very little evidence. The book, by the way, has been published in several languages, including thanks to the ex-Deputy Minister of Education of Korea into Korean as well. We had the pleasure of Mr. Gwonjo Kim being on our team when we produced the report. Since then, we've looked at the implications on financing and some of the evidence in a paper that's about to come out with my colleague and friend Hessel Oosterbeek on the evidence on the financing implications. One of the speakers today already talked about the implications of learning and the changes that we need to go through. If we could summarize that in the past, much of education was information-based with a lot of rote learning and terminal, meaning that there were certain levels of education and people completed those levels, perhaps went on, and at some point their education ended. Now we think much more about lifelong learning, about opportunities that would be around for many years and people could go back and learn, create, improve their own human capital. One of the concerns we have for many of our client countries, many low-income, middle-income countries, is that the level of preparedness for the knowledge economy is not where it might be. Here's some very limited information about some very high-income countries and some middle-income countries, and the level of what's known as information processing is very low for some middle-income countries. The situation is even worse for low-income countries. At the same time, while education maintains a high return, profitability measured by wages, there is a slight decline as more and more people are getting educated. This is something I will come back to at the very end. And much of the difference in the returns over time has been the increase in the premium that goes to people with higher education and a decrease in the premium for people with very low skill levels, here measured as primary or elementary schooling. So the wage differential has been increasing in all countries, favoring people with more education. In our report, we looked at the priorities for education. We concluded that the priority for basic education remains, but that education and learning opportunities needed to be expanded, and for this, more resources were needed, not less, and that more innovative solutions to financing were required. So we explored both public and private options and looking at different combinations of the two. We looked at cost recovery measures and subsidies. I'll talk more about cost recovery because they relate much more to the higher education sector, and end with something on what some people have called entitlements, which is a combination of a loan, voucher, or subsidy program. In terms of traditional financing mechanisms, the student loans have been around for a long time. They exist in developed countries, developing countries. We have examples all over the world. More innovative models have come into play in recent years. One is known as human capital contracts, the other income contingent loans. They both share a common origin. Both can be traced back to the writings of Milton Friedman, who argued that education at the higher levels could be financed through future earnings, so that people were not required to pay upfront for their education, and that the payment would depend on their future earnings. So creating new resources for education through financing with students' future learning once they, future earnings once they graduated from university. The human capital contracts, a very private mechanism where lenders would take an interest in a student going on to university studies, and in exchange for a percentage of future earnings for a specified period. So it's literally a contract between an investor and the student. The income contingent loans, similar concept, but here the idea is tuition would be paid. Students who didn't pay the tuition could opt for an income contingent loan, which means that once they graduated, a percentage of the income would be paid back to the lender, government in most cases, and that this payment would depend on earnings. So once they reach a certain level, the student pays back until the loan is repaid. If earnings dip below a certain level, no payment is made. So there's protection for students who did not get a job or didn't get a job that paid a sufficiently high wage. This might be a very good instrument in times of crisis as the present one. The subsidy mechanisms, I won't go into too much detail, but we have vouchers, or we can call them scholarships. There are learning accounts that are mostly for non-university studies, but for continuous learning. Several examples exist. Some of them have been evaluated. I won't go into the evidence on this, but I just want to mention that one thing I might come back to is the concept of saving for future learning. Tax credits, and finally entitlements. In terms of evidence, we don't find a lot of rigorous evidence, and the way that we organized our thoughts in our report was a program could be judged to have sufficiently strong evidence base if there was a clear treatment and control group that we could identify the program. So in other words, we want to be able to say that there was a causality between the program and the final outcomes. We see very little evidence if we use this standard, and we find that there's a need for much more research in these areas. The best evaluations, we might argue, are random assignment, where beneficiaries are given the program, are assigned to groups randomly, and then we monitor outcomes over time. There are other techniques that also give the same properties or similar properties to be used. In terms of traditional loan programs, very few rigorous evaluations exist. Let me give one example, the Mexico Student Loan Program, known as SOFES. This is an interesting program where the lender is the private sector, the beneficiaries are students that go to private universities, but the origin of the program is public, so guaranteed by the Mexican government, financed through a loan by the World Bank. The program is now almost self-sustaining. The program gives loans to middle and low-income students to attend private universities. The researchers used the fact that there was a regression discontinuity, or in other words, a systematic differentiation between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. So at some point, the categories for allowing people to get the loan were cut off. So using the cutoff in terms of loan eligibility, you can use the people that are just above and just below as your treatment and control groups. So the authors used this technique to look at the causal impact of the program. They followed up both beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries over time, and find that the beneficiaries, people who got the loans through the program, SOFES, not only got more education, they also did better academically than students without such credits. The only problem is that there is self-selection. People have to apply to the loan program, and they have to continue their education. These caveats notwithstanding, there's still evidence that the program had an effect on enrollments and actually increased the share of lower income students in the university system. Economists have come to study the concept of debt aversion. This is simply the concept that people prefer not to carry large amounts of debt, and the studies have looked at how this affects university enrollment and university performance. The studies that have been the most rigorous have actually been conducted at elite universities in the United States, so among the best universities in the United States, among very good students. And still, the authors find significant debt aversion, meaning that people prefer not to use loans. And this has significant impact for how much we can expand university education through loan programs. If there's debt aversion in the top universities, the situation could be severe in other types of institutions. The student loans that most countries have, authors have named them mortgage-type loans because they resemble a loan that people take to finance the purchase of a home. That is, there's a fixed payment, comes every month or at a regular interval, and there's no change in that amount that's requested each month. So this fixed payment program has been shown in many countries to limit enrollments of university students, especially people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, the poor, low-income families. And collection has been very poor in most countries, especially speaking here about developing countries. The collection has been so poor in some countries that it would have been more cost-effective to simply give grants than to have the loan program. The collection has been poor, and the programs usually operate at a loss. So a very poor record in terms of mortgage-type loans, and not a very effective measure for increasing enrollments of disadvantaged students. The income contingent loans, probably the best evidence that we have has been the studies of Chapman looking at the Australian program, probably the longest lasting income contingent program since the 1980s. The program was started in a way, Australia at the time had very low enrollment rates at universities compared to other OECD countries, and the argument then was to use future earnings to finance expansion of universities in Australia. So the first thing that they did was to introduce tuition. So we had low enrollments and no tuition. So the first response was increased tuition. But with this tuition came the option for students that they didn't have to pay it up front. They could opt for an income contingent loan, and the payment would be made much later over the life of the graduate's career, taking into account increase and decrease in earnings, not to penalize students with low earnings. The result was that the program expanded significantly university enrollments, and today Australia has among the highest enrollment rates in university. And the evidence so far is that the program did not hurt enrollments of low-income students from low-income families. The human capital contracts, we've tried to find evidence of these programs. So far, there are only 3 programs that exist that I know of. The first one was a company called My Rich Uncle. The program started as giving human capital contracts. It then switched a few years later to for standard types of student loans. We don't know why. And this year, the program shut down operations altogether, given the credit squeeze in the United States and lack of resources for expanding the program. This is a significant development in the market, given that it represented a very innovative program in the private sector, all private finance, no guarantees, and then the switch to the standard private loans and now completely out of the market. This led a lot of students having to withdraw from their studies and use private resources to finance their education. In September, when the program ceased to give new loans, there was coverage in the press, including in CNN, on what students did because of this program, and the people that stayed in universities were those who could draw on their private savings or family to support their schooling, given that also there's a lack of credit for student financing in general. The other program in Germany is called Career Concept. This continues to grow. There are over 100 students that have been financed with human capital contracts, and as far as we know, the program continues to grow. And finally, Lumni is a company that's based in Miami, started operating in Chile, and now has students from Colombia and Mexico, and even financed their first student in the United States. This program has been recognized by, amongst others, the Inter-American Development Bank, and has received some financing and some venture capital funding for their innovative nature. Very few students have been financed so far, and no results yet on what happens to graduates once they complete. So some interesting things going on. Unfortunately, the biggest company has ceased to operate in terms of human capital contracts. Some very interesting experiments have been undertaken in terms of giving financial incentives for students. And here the interest wasn't only to finance enrollment, but also to try and improve the quality or student outcomes through grades and such. The one interesting experiment, there are others that we discuss in the book, but this one in Canada offered students three options. One was peer advising and study groups, so kind of services. The second option was a scholarship. If the student had significantly high grades, they would receive financial support for the next year. And finally, a third group could get both interventions. So these were offered randomly to groups of students, but the take-up rates were very low for services alone. People didn't want to get only the services. They were much more interested if they were offered either scholarships or the combination of services and scholarships. In terms of results, the program had a bigger impact on females than males, and in fact, no impact on grades for males, regardless of which option was taken up. In terms of looking at the impact of fees on enrollment rates, and this is another disturbing fact, some researchers from Harvard, including Susan Dinarski, have looked at the impact of small tuition increases on the enrollment of students.
2 minutes.
Again,
2 minutes.
Thank you. Again, looking at very good universities in the United States, and they find that a small increase in tuition of, say, $1,000 would decrease enrollment by 1 to 6 percentage points. So again, the coming or the financial crisis that we're in will probably lead to more of this outcome. The entitlements, the combination of the loan with the voucher, which has been discussed in theory, there are two examples. One that has been studied is the U.S. GI Bill. This goes back many decades, program offering returning veterans an opportunity to go back to school, and very positive results in these studies. Finally, before I conclude, I wanted to, when I was preparing this presentation, I felt kind of odd talking about financing education or expanding financing at a time of one of the biggest financial crises. So I looked at the evidence on the impact of crises on labor market outcomes, looking at wages. And I found evidence for three crises. The first is Argentina's 2000-2001 crisis, where there was a significant reduction in economic activity, as you can see from the growth rate going down, yet the returns to education increased, and they continued to increase over time during the crisis and after the crisis. The other one is Mexico. There are actually two or three crisis periods, depending on how we look at this. The big one in 1995 is also accompanied by an increase in the returns to schooling. They actually go down during growth periods. And finally, the 97 financial crisis here, evidenced from Thailand. The returns to education are about the same from the 70s to the 90s until the crisis when the returns start to go up. There's probably two reasons for this. One, which goes back to human capital theory, is that in times of crises, in times of change, disequilibria, people with more skills, measured by more education perhaps, can adjust to the changes, do very well, and the returns go up. The other one is that low-skilled individuals, more likely to lose their jobs during crises, earnings for that group will decline as well, and again that brings about an increase in the returns to schooling overall. So the bottom line is, during crises, people that already have high levels of human capital, are already doing well, will continue to do well, or they won't do as bad as people with less skills. So the crisis will affect the financing of education. People mentioned this yesterday. The important thing is to find mechanisms that allow people to tap into new sources. Perhaps we should think about, during good times, savings programs that allow people to have more resources they can call upon during these crises, because the people that will lose are the people that have less skills, lower earnings, and they'll suffer significant penalties. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. We have now two discussions. The first is Yang Li, Associate Professor at Hanyang University, specialist in international finance. Please, if you could give your remarks.
Thank you, Chairperson. This is Yang Li at Hanyang University. It is a great honor to make questions and some short presentation about Korean situation. And the main purpose of my discussion is try to get some insight and expertise to shed some light on what we can do in Korea. So my presentation consists of two parts. First one is some questions, and the second one is I will give you a very short presentation about the situation of higher education in Korea, and some talk about some recent development, and try to get some advice how we proceed on that. Right, some questions for all presenters is financing. We can categorize this financing in three types. First one is institution-based, so give some subsidy to some university. Or the second option is give some subsidy to some programs, some research program, or some subsidies to some specific some education program, and so on. And the third option is individual-based one. So give some scholarship to student, or give some research grant to some research professor, or a team of some researchers, right? So, and which of all these three types of this financing method is better? I mean, in my thinking, I think it depends on some stage of economic and social development, and maybe we can combine this one, and maybe each one can have some pros and cons and so on, right? So, and second question, actually, the reason why I raised this question is that these are some questions we have, and try to decide which one is better and so on. And the second question is, what is some best quality assurance system for university? And I think there are many different ways that can be done in the world. Maybe it is very publicly done, maybe like in European countries, or it is some combine of a private and public one. So which one will be better? And the third question, general question, is a very specific one. So in Korea, after we have a democratization in late 80s, the president of a university was selected by some direct voting by professors and students, sometimes students, and so on. So, and we now realize that that is not really a good thing, because this elected president is captured by interest group and so on. So which one is the better way to find the president of university? And the two questions for Dr. Petrinos, and actually this is my second time to meet him and to learn from him. And there cost recovery measures, three things that we are interested in. So first one is a mortgage type loan, and second one is a graduate tax and ICL. And which one is a better one? And actually what we have since 2005 is that mortgage type student loan. That is a quite large scale one. And now we are thinking about introducing ICL, right? So some questions about that. And the problem we have is that unlike UK and Australia, they start from, say, free education for tertiary one, they introduce the tuition. So to help students, they just provide this, the ICL, right? So that is how they evolve in those countries. But unlike them, what we have is private lending, some mortgage type one, and then we try to combine that one with the ICL, right? So, and that kind of case we cannot find. So what is the better way to do that? And questions for Dr. Schmidt. And the first one is, to what extent this distance learning replace traditional learning? I'm also a professor at one university. So, and I think there is something that cannot be replaced by this some internet, right? So personal contact, some eye contact, and some discussions, making questions, and so on. So maybe we will see complete replacement. Instead of that one, maybe we will see some supplementary use of this distance learning and this traditional way of teaching, I believe, right? And in this in OLI experiment, how self-selection was addressed. I mean, there is one sentence explained that there is some randomized assignment of a student, half of them are assigned, but still I believe I'm an economist, so I'm concerned about the endogenous problem. So someone who are better motivated, maybe select to take this OLI and show some better performance. Maybe that might explain. And the final one is OECD assessment schedule, and how successful will it be? Because this tertiary one is a more diverse some education. I mean, and the performance they show is not from tertiary education. Maybe they learned that from secondary education and so on. So I don't know. But anyway, we can measure it. But I think there is some difficulties there. And I will just quickly explain what is the Korean's tertiary education. So key characteristics. The first one I want to point out is that we are heavily rely on private institutions. So 80%. Already that slide was on here. And government to provide a very small amount and privately funded one. So, and very, very rapid expansion of tertiary education in Korea. Now, I believe entrance rate from high school to college is the highest in Korea. So that is more than 80%. So last year we have 84% of high school graduates go to college. So it's like a universal education in Korea, right? So that is, and here is, I believe, this very familiar table you already see. So Korea, how this public education is financed. Look at the tertiary one. Public share is this is relative to GDP. So 0.5% is provided by government, and 1.8 is provided by private one. So just 1/3 is provided by public one, and that I believe in total maybe 1/5, 1/4, right? On the other hand, OECD average is the other way, right? So what we are thinking about is, unlike what U.S. I mean, European countries are doing, we are going the opposite direction. So try to, say, persuade government to provide more money to higher education. So that is what we have. And here is some student enrollment for each country, and we can see some three types. So private one, but heavily dependent on public finance. So institution-based, some finance by the government provide to university in UK, and some public university one. And here at the bottom we see Korea and Japan, and also US have some mixture of private and public one. And so we are at the bottom and try to move a little bit upward, right? So that is what we're trying to do. And try to explain, introduce some key program. Actually, I think 2 minutes maybe. So is that this mortgage type student loan was introduced in 2005, right? And it is quite successful, actually. And now we are thinking about moving one step further to introducing ICL, right? So I think, I hope that we can get some insight about how to proceed it from, I think especially Dr. Petrianos, right? Right, and the second one is use some quality assurance system is try to build, and that is based on 4 elements. So first one is legal requirement is imposed on public side information about enrollment, finance, and everything. So now we can see that on the internet and compare that, right? So that is one. And the second one is self-evaluation by the institution is also required by the law, right? And the outside evaluation, and also that outside evaluation institution can be recognized the Ministry of Education and Science and Technology. We have a new ministry. And fourth one is government financing are connected to these informations and the self-evaluations, and so the 2 examples about some financing method. First one, I want to, in Korean, we said 교육 역량 강화 사업. This is the one we introduced this year, and that is a program for strengthening education capacity of university. That is my translation, so not the official one, but anyway. So here, we don't have RFP. We just use some objective measures like enrollment rate, employment rate, and so on. And we put them 8 groups and select around 1/3 of universities and provide just a subsidy, some block grant. And the only requirement that is attached is 20% of that money should be used as a scholarship to their student, right? So this is a new program we started, and try to give some incentive to improve performance. And second new program is we call the World-Class University, and this is a subsidy program for foreign visiting scholars, and also encourages some fusion of multidisciplines, and so that is what we have, right? So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very complete presentation. Yes. Before the panelists answer, I think it's better to have the remarks coming from the Professor Yong Sum Ha, who is Professor of Public Administration in Yonsei, who has been working also a long time for Ministry of Education as an economist and specialist of public finance. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and I'm very honored to be part of this session, but I believe we have very serious time constraints, so I'll try to make my comments as brief as possible. And I'm not such an organized person such as Professor Young Mi, so I didn't prepare any of PPT film. My first comments goes to Mr. Petrinos, and I'm very delighted to hear the variety of ways of financing higher education, and especially income contingent loans. ICL is a relatively recent concept and relatively new concept in Korea, but the Korean government is seriously considering the adoption of ICL. I'm a principal investigator of the project team on ICL in Korea, and this research has been funded by the Korean Ministry of Education, Science and Technology. The day before yesterday, we had a public hearing on the adoption of ICL in Korea, and Professor Leung Lee participated in that hearing as a panelist also. In addition to the two critical aspects of ICL you mentioned, that is taxation system and vast majority of institutions being public universities, Korea has two additional problems. One is too many college students problems. As Professor Lee mentioned, approximately 84% of high school graduates go to the college. This is highest number in the world, and this is very high, not just in terms of absolute numbers, but it's very high for the Korean economy to absorb. It means that Korea can have a very high default rate compared to other countries. And the other interesting feature of Korea is that the Korean government is considering the adoption of ICL in response to the social disputes on the level of tuition fees. As you know, in New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom, ICL was adopted when the university education shifted from free education to fee-paying system. But in Korea, ICL is being considered as a way of supporting college students. It means that the adoption of ICL in Korea will increase rather than reduce the financial burden of the government. So I hope Mr. Petronas can give us useful tips to cope with these challenges. And my second comment goes to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith rightly points that financial support in the past has been based on the input measure, and there is a great need to shift to the outcome measure. For this purpose, he suggested three examples of innovations. That is OCW and Open Educational Resources and the so-called AHELLO. AHELLO is a very interesting and challenging endeavor, and I believe it can serve as a useful outcome measure if it's successfully developed. But I don't see a strong link between OCW, OER, and the specific measurement of educational achievement. They can be another input measure, in a sense. And the more difficult question is how to link OCW and OER with the funding of higher education. And I would like to hear from Mr. Smith about these specific features of outcome measures. My third comment goes to President Richen. President Richen rightly points out that world universities shift from nation building to world building. Yet he's mostly silent on the question of how world building translates in the context of curricula and the organization of universities, though he mentioned this question in the introduction. I'd like to hear from Professor Richen the specific features of curricula and organizational changes European universities are undergoing, or you can simply give your own university's experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then there are many, many questions. We need about 2 hours, if you allow. Then, Josef Ritzen, if you want to answer the first, and general questions and special questions for you.
Thank you so much. I think those comments were very, very well taken. They also gave us an opportunity, indeed, to bring, again, many of the points forward, and I won't do that. What actually I'd try to do is to raise the confusion to a higher level. That is because many of the questions were based on the actual situation and not as much on the desired development. So when I want to answer to this question on finance, I would repeat time and again, think about what you want to see as development and make sure that your financial instruments are supportive to that development. And then I immediately would like to make one small step in the sense of the answer is not in the sense of one system of finance for one country. It first should be looked at as something which is a system in its environment. I think Korea's future is one of Asia and the world. So look at your financing system in terms of training for the globalized labor market. And then making the connection also with my colleague here at my left-hand side, I would particularly finance to bring about the changes as were mentioned. Now in this respect, when I was a minister, I introduced something of an output measure as the only country in the world at that time, and now being also followed by Denmark and by Ireland, which is a formula-based financing, but based on outcomes. And the outcome is a diploma, because we didn't have any other measures. And we are trying now to develop that more, I would say, in depth, looking also at quality assessments, so bringing these elements together. At the end, I think in terms of the financing mechanisms, at the end you will have a kind of a complex system where you would like to look very much at what as government you want to achieve, which is an institutional development leading to a focus of universities on the globalized labor market and on, I would say, world leadership, but also very much on emancipation. That's not a Korean problem. With the 84% participation, you are in just the perfect shape. I'm so surprised to hear that from your side as a problem, and would say, I would love to have your problems. I would love to have your problems. The basic problem in the Western world is that we are not reaching enough students, and particularly not enough students, say, with a traditionally different background. Immigrant children who have not had in their family environment the experience of participation in higher education. So in this respect, also in financing, you would, in most parts of the world, look for very much the kind of financing which brings in those groups. In this respect, I think also I would like to suggest to Mr. Petrinos to look far more at also these elements in terms of, I think his analysis was perfect on the macro level, but I'm very much interested in, also as an ex-politician and once a politician, always a politician, I would very much interested in why you are interested in certain groups. And so I would like very much to make a differentiation and always think about a combination of student loans and student grants, for the grants with respect to those groups you want to bring in. And maybe leaving it at this with one small thing to be added in response to Professor Ha. The curricular changes. In the paper which I submitted, I tried to indicate those, and those were very much complementary. The curricular changes are very much in line with curricular changes reflecting the present position of graduates. Curricular changes reflecting the proven efficiency of problem-based learning, proven efficiency of web-based or e-learning, the proven efficiency of dual trajectories, proven efficiency of joint degrees. So in this respect, those are curricular changes, but then very much I think they should be linked with a financing mechanism in which you indeed give the incentives to reach those.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Right. Some very quick answers to some of the questions. The issue about the selection, self-selection, in the experiment that I mentioned. I suggest that you go to the Carnegie Mellon website under OLI, and you can get the study there. They actually did random assignment. It is a randomized trial. Students were split into two groups. Every student involved in the experiment was interested in taking the computer side of it, and they were randomly split into the traditional and into the computer. In fact, almost all the students who were signed up for statistics in that particular semester were interested in taking just the computer side. So I think it's a pretty good design, and They're trying it now in 7 or 8 different institutions other than Carnegie Mellon, including some community colleges. That's the answer to that one. The second one on distance learning in general. One hears all the time that there is really something special about being in a residential university where you get to know the professors and you get to know the students and so on. And I think there is. I mean, I've taught in 3 of them. They're wonderful institutions. They're comfortable. They're wonderful for the students there. Most students in the United States are not in those institutions. They're in some other institutions. They're in community colleges where they have to drive to get there to go to school at night. They don't have that kind of residential capacity. They're not staying with other students. They're of all different ages. The kinds of interactions are totally different interactions. And just to go to something that Professor Ritson said, you know, the problem in the U.S. and in many other nations in Europe are that we are not bringing enough students into 4-year institutions. California designed its systems, this California system now, the greatest university system probably in the world for one state or one region. It was designed for 30% of the population, the eligible population, because it was designed in 1960. We cannot afford to build all the campuses that are needed to move it up to 50 or 60%, which is what is required for California's economy in the near future. We have to do it some other way. So students go to these community colleges, but students could also learn at home. And they could learn at home through distance learning of this sort, which could be connected to lots of other people, because we can connect now through the web in ways that we could never have connected before. And so they could be connected to people taking the same course in Korea. And they could become partners in working out some set of problems, so that there's a huge possibilities here.
Learning will replace the traditional learning?
I think over time, I think that over time, we're talking about lifelong learning now. We're talking about changing jobs 7 or 8 times. I mean, that seems to be the norm now for many people in the United States and in much of the developed world. So you change those jobs. You have to learn something new. If you want to get into a good position in those new jobs, you should learn something. You can't trot back to school while you're raising your children at the same time. And so you sit down at your computer in the evening and you learn the material. And you learn it from very creatively constructed courses that are maybe game design, that are really interesting, that are built by the best people in the world. So you're not losing in this game. In fact, you may be winning because you have access to these kinds of materials. Why don't I stop there? There were other questions, but I can perhaps answer them after the meeting.
I think we have no time because it's time.
Okay, thank you. Many good questions. Let me focus on one that was common on the income contingent loans. I can't do justice to it, and I'm sure that both Dr. Young Lee and Dr. Ha know more than I do about this by now. But just 4 suggestions. One is, while I agree with Professor Ritson that you still need subsidies and grants, those should be explicit and finance specific groups or items. In other words, don't mix the loan with the subsidy. If you go for ICL, the loan rate, whatever it's based on, should be the same for everyone, because we no longer need to distinguish between the poor and the rich once people get into university. If they don't do well in the labor market, they won't pay, so you have no penalty for the disadvantage. Second point, I don't think that having private institutions is a constraint. I think it just so happens that the countries with the longest experience with ICL happen to have mostly public institutions. What I think is critical is the collection through the taxation system. I think this is something that will limit ICL in most countries, but not a country like Korea. So I think having the taxation system is critical for the collection and making it efficient. Also means that the Minister of Education no longer in the business of financing students. Third, I would argue that the ICL be costed properly. In Australia at one time, the rates were higher for people in professions that were expected to earn more rather than costing the actual provision of the program. The fourth point is, I'm not sure I understood the point that the ICL would increase the burden on government. I think in New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, the loans are considered assets in the budget, not debits. And finally, on the equity point, I think here is the unknown. We think that in Australia, the enrollment rates of the people from low-income families were not hurt by the program. But again, this is based on before and after. We don't know what would have happened without the program. So given that you have a diverse education system, I would also suggest a pilot and perhaps a different pilot for private and public universities, specifically to address the equity question.
I think, unfortunately, we have no time to discussion because we have to leave the room for the next panel. And with 5 panelists, it was a very, very long session. Thank you very much for your attention. And thank you for all the panelists.
10 minutes left.